Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we talked about the economy and the rise of the towns and the rise of a merchant class in Renaissance society. And so this is kind of a new class, or it's a class that's much more prominent in the Renaissance period than it is in the medieval period prior to the Renaissance. Now we're going to talk about the two classes that were dominant in medieval society and how their positions change during the period of the Renaissance. So we're talking about the nobles, and we're talking about the peasants. So we begin with the nobles. The nobles are at an economic disadvantage as we enter the Renaissance. We talked about this a little bit before. This is a legacy of the Black Death. Now they have fewer workers. They're having to pay their workers more money. There's less demand for food, and so they're receiving more money for the food they produce, or the food that is produced on their lands. And so they're economically getting hit from both sides as we enter the Renaissance period. They're also increasingly militarily obsolete. Remember that the whole reason why they had been given these lands in the first place typically was that they were to provide the king with military support. They were to come themselves as armed knights on horseback. They were the most effective troops of the medieval period. As they saw with the 100 Years' War, that's starting to change. It's becoming much more important to have basically to be able to attack the enemy from a distance, either with archery or with artillery. Some of these nobles become condottieri. We talked about what this term refers to in the last class, in the last week. So some of them basically become soldiers for hire. Some of these people were noble and simply fighting for causes that they considered good in order to raise money. Some of them were seeking violence and seeking pleasure. So some were honorable and some were not. The wealthier nobles, however, were able to preserve and even improve their quality of life. So during this period, that castles become much more livable. So we're basically transitioning from this picture that you see at the top right to pictures on the two pictures on the bottom. So castles become much more comfortable. They're surrounded by beautiful gardens. They're less of a strategic concern. They become more residences rather than strong points. There's a new sort of cult of etiquette that becomes more prominent at this time. So the idea of eating properly, the invention of the fork that takes place during this period, certain manners and ways of behaving that distinguish someone as someone noble, these, excuse me, these become more prominent during this period. However, this also means that the life of the nobles and the life of the castle is becoming more removed from the rest of society. So whereas previously the nobles have been the leaders, they've been the overseers of the peasants who are working the lands, now they're making some money from their lands. They're making more money by investing in these new merchant bank companies that are developing. There's less of a relationship with the peasants who work their lands. And so, again, these bonds of medieval society are being disappearing or becoming less prominent, and they're being replaced instead by a society that's more segmented, that's more individual. Peasant life was still very, very difficult, but it was becoming easier. It was certainly the condition of many peasants was an improvement on the medieval period. And it's important to remember that while the nobles were becoming more marginalized in some ways, they still had a monopoly on leading political and church offices. They still had the best diets and the most comfortable lives of people in this society. So you don't need to feel, if you're in danger of feeling sorry for the nobles, you don't need to feel too sorry for them just yet. After the Black Death, peasants are no longer tied to the land, and this being tied to the land was known as serfdom. So previously, you would have peasants who, and again, I talked about this with the Black Death, the land that you grew up in, you would be required to work that land. That was the land that you were allowed to work for the Lord. You could keep part of the food that was produced from that land for your own family. Now that starts to change. More and more we see peasants able to demand a wage rather than just being tied to the land. They're able to kind of choose who they work for. Some of them are even starting to own the land themselves. So they're no longer just renting out strips of land to cultivate on behalf of the lord who owns the land. Some of them are actually coming to own the land themselves. And so this again is part of a segmentation of the society or an atomized society, that even the peasants themselves are becoming more individualized, more reliant on themselves. The bonds that they would have had with the Lord, those are starting to disappear. Now, over 90% of the population was still farmers. I've talked a lot about how there's less demand for food at this time, but it's definitely the case that most of the population still need to be growing food. We live in a unique period in history where about 1 to 2% of the population grow the food for everyone else. In the Renaissance period, this was still basically the reverse. 9 out of 10 of the percent 90% of the population was still growing the food for everyone, including the 10% who were not farming. They followed a 3-field crop rotation system. This was an innovation that came about later in the medieval period, enabled them to grow more food, grow more crops during the year. Animals were much smaller. This was pretty mind-blowing to me. Cattle were about a third of the weight that they are today. An individual sheep often only produced about a pound of wool per animal. So diets are poor, animals are smaller. But during this period, we start to see that the animals are growing. They're starting to become larger. And this is basically the result of a virtuous cycle. People are becoming better at farming. There's more food that's available. They're introducing new products like alfalfa. These mean that the animals grow bigger. It means you have more milk, you have more meat, you have more wool. And this means that the situation for the average peasant is improving. And so it becomes a virtuous cycle. Most peasants lived in farming villages, like you see here, populations of around 500 to 700 people. They had houses, 2-room houses, and you think, well, that's kind of the same as people in the towns, except that the 2-room houses that the peasants lived in also included their animals. So any cows or chickens or geese or goats that you had, those would also come in with you in the night. They often lived near walled towns or castles, so they could go there for safety in times of war. Men and women both worked in the field. Even children as young as 5, we know, worked in the fields. Aside from farmers, there were a couple of specialized trades in each village. A miller to grind the grain into flour, a baker to bake the flour into bread, a blacksmith to take care of shoeing oxen and horses that were used for pulling the plows. Fruit was still too expensive to be a part of your typical peasant's diet, and meat was very rare. There would also be a church, as you can see depicted here, that was the center of the social life of the community. And most peasants wore woolen clothes and wooden shoes. And the diet that they lived on was typically dried bread and dried beans. So that gives you a sense. So basically, we're getting to a stage where food supply is reliable. By the time we get into the 1400s, it's uncommon to die from lack of food, but the food is not great. So most women were married by the time they were 23. Most couples had about 3 to 4 children, and about half of them would survive until adulthood. So this is still a very difficult society to live in. Okay, I'm going to take a pause here. I'm going to come back and talk about scientific achievement in the next video.